First, David, I have a new
You have a
idea.
little theory, don't you?
We wanted to start because I think I've cracked the code. I've been scrolling on Twitter, like the Matrix, and finally a picture started to emerge of what exactly we all need to do, which is this. I think we need to start a new group. So it would, whatever your groups you're in, if you're in DSA, if you're, just at your workplace, start a group that is dedicated to doing things the right way and not doing things that are unproductive or bad. And we need to be really rigid about like listing those things and keeping it to it. And I think if as long as we hold to those ideals, I think probably we'll have climate change and capitalism sorted 2034-ish. What do you
That
think?
makes sense. Instead of trying to grow and to build out, we should make sure. I mean, because the problem right now with the left is that it's too big. I think almost anybody, any socialist would agree that the socialist movement is too large. So what we need to be doing is we need to be culling as many
Quality
members as
assurance.
possible. No, I mean, obviously Matt and I are, messing around a little bit, but we wanted to talk about this and not by naming any names or like getting fixated on kind of drama. But this has been a big fear that we have had since the end of the Bernie campaign, which is that the American left does what the American left has been very successful at doing, which is falling into extreme factionalism and kind of petty internal fights that might feel very, very important ideologically and philosophically. But when it actually comes to moving the ball forward in class struggle, they don't tend to, really focus and harness our energies in a way that is able to challenge the bosses and the war machine, fight climate change. There's a great essay by Hal Draper, who was one of the great American socialists, called The Anatomy of the Microsect. And I just wanted to quote a little bit from it because I was reading this essay earlier this week, and it was a little frightening to see something that was written in 1973, right? At a period of time when the socialist left was, nowhere near power or anything like that. But it's before the great wilderness, right? It's before these like lost years of politics where, left movements and socialist movements very much either fell into even more sectarian activity or completely, fell into, they basically lost any real connection with the working class in politics in any meaningful way, right? They became book clubs. And there's a lot in this essay that's great, but I want to note his definition of what a sect is, because I think it's a really important way of conceiving of what a sect is. A sect presents itself as the embodiment of the socialist movement, though it is a membership organization whose boundary is set more or less rigidly by the points in its political program rather than by its relation to the social struggle. And this, I think, is really spot on, and we're starting to see the beginnings of of this rise with a lot of American leftists, a lot of American socialists, where it's a kind of feeling, right, that if we can just find the one true socialism, right, the one pure socialism, if we can come out with a party platform that is perfect in every way, then we will achieve socialism. But I'm going to tell you right now, there were a lot of really smart socialists in our history who came up with really incredible platforms. And man, you start to wish, I wish these people were pulling the levers of government and had the way to implement these things to put them into power. What you find more and more is, despite developing, strong, robust critique of American imperialism and American capitalism and getting rid of any member who, questioned these tenets, these organizations were not able to implement the social change that's necessary. And why is that? It's the second part of what Hal Draper is talking about here. It's an organization that's defining itself by the points in its political program rather than by its relation to the social struggle. And this isn't just a nitpicking thing. This is one of the great mistakes that leftists make, and it's even worse now, I would argue, after decades of like neoliberal enculturation for many people, especially our age, right? Of one thinking about politics as a personal, individual activity rather than as a member of a collective or a group, or God forbid, a political class, that being the working class, right? losing that connection to the social struggle means you have abandoned your vehicle. You have abandoned the very thing what you argue as a socialist is going to allow you to achieve victory. We've said this time and time again. Why is the working class important to socialists and to Marxists? Not because it's necessarily the most exploited class or the worse off class or anything like that, right? Certainly, there's a lot of history that can, make that argument, but that's not the reason why it's important to this theory of social change. It's important because labor and workers create the value in society, the vast majority of value in society, right? And because of that specific position in the production process in society, they have the ability to flip this system on its head and create something that is far more beneficial to the masses, is less warlike, and has these veins of utopian hope of a better future, of a future that is socialized in the most beautiful sense of those terms, that we are able to live in a system where our needs are met and where we are working with one another, right? That's the radical proletarian dream, and it emanates and emerges from the working class. What happens a lot is that socialism, and Marxism in particular, as like a grand social theory, it attracts a lot of dreamers and people, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it attracts a kind of mentality that people spend so much time trying to paint themselves as a radical or a revolutionary that they forget that it's not about you as an individual, it's about you as a member of a social class, right? And it's an extremely dangerous mistake to make, and it's one that in this country, which has unfortunately a very backwards socialist movement, after years and years of heavy-handedness from our opponents, both the ruling class, but also the media and our education system and all of those factors, right? Has been beaten down. And we're falling back into these older mistakes in a way that really worries me.
Yeah, I wanted to bring out, I think, a part we both highlighted, but an interesting section here. Very few. It's also interesting to me the tone this is written in, and I wanted to include just some of that. But very few so-called or self-styled Marxists have understood the heart of Marx's approach to to proletarian socialism. The basic strategy for building socialist movement lies in fusing two movements, the class movement for this or that step, which gets a decisive sector of the class into collision with the established powers of the state and bourgeoisie, which is like you were talking about the workers. A collision on whatever scale possible, and the work of permeating this class movement with educational propaganda for social revolution, which integrates the two.
Yeah. And and that's such a phenomenal point there, because he's not saying, and we're not saying, that having robust debate is not important. Hell, a lot of this channel and a lot of the work that we do is about the work of political education. Go and read your Leo Panich. This is critical work of socialists to do the political education. But for the political education to come to fruition, the point of doing it is not just to sit around and argue about theory and argue about things in books. It's about equipping the people who have the ability to change the system with the tools that they need, right? And that is the role of a socialist movement, of people who are spending time recognizing what's happening in history, what's happening around them, right? So that we can be here when these moments of collision happen to point and say, this is the way, this is the direction that we need to go, right? I mean, to give people like a kind of concrete example of this, if you spent any time protesting or marching, right? You know what it's like to be in a movement or a march that has direction versus one that doesn't, right? There's that moment people come out in the streets and they want to display their dissatisfaction, right? But then there's those moments when you take the people in the street and you do something with them, right? You shut something down, or you make, or you make some kind of point, or, a spectacle that brings more and more people in the movement, right? You know what it's like when you're in a march or a movement or of that nature, when there is some form of direction. And that is the role of socialists in these kind of movements and moments. But there has been this development of a kind of socialist that doesn't recognize the importance of organization and of being rooted in their class. Rather, they think that just by sitting outside of society, they're going to be able to build something different. I'll tell you right now, the people who benefit the most from this society, this oppressive society, are very happy for the kind of lifestyle socialists rather than organizers and embedded socialists. But before we even, because honestly, I know we have to get to Lance, but I wanted to make this point too, because Matt and I were talking before we got on. And the thing that is sort of frustrating about this moment right now is while we're talking about the problem with like sects and like sectarianism, right? In a lot of ways, what we're seeing right now is like we're not even seeing a sectarian movement because we're not seeing people who are members of organizations really being the ones behind a lot of the issues. We're seeing like a kind of like pre-sectarian movement. And what I mean by that are people who are not in political organizations or not involved in this work, but are actively consuming and watching a lot of politics and a lot of things that are going on, spending their time trying to derail or prevent any kind of new formation from coming into being by constantly pointing out, you know, some problem, real or perceived, with these. That is like an advanced form of American political neurosis that we really need to squash out. And to just squash it out by inviting people in and trying to like have, you know, outward facing, bring people in movements. But we also need to start calling this thing out because it's not achieving the victories or the goals that a lot of people think that it is.
Yeah, you know, I get a lot in this past year. I've gotten every once in a while you get somebody says, or you see a comment saying, yeah, I've moved to the left of your content, Matt Leck. And there's two kinds I would categorize those. One is the one I've really no problem with, the person who is like gone and like, I'm not really watching YouTube politics at all. I'm actually doing something in my community, whether it's like trying to form a union or, you know, joining DSA or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's the other group of people who think that like they'll tell me the new shows and that they're supporting on Patreon as if like that's moving to the left. And that is an expression of American consumerism, just completely perverted to the point where literally your political identity is what you consume.
And it's individual too.
Yes.
And that's the really dangerous aspect of it as well. No, I think yeah, exactly. And I think that's like a, you know, very, very true point. And even beyond that, I mean, not to be too hot takey, but I think a big part of this does come out of the fact that so much of the left and our infrastructure came out of the Bernie Sanders movement, which was, again, what we needed to do. It was a Hail Mary. But it was definitely an important moment, one, at bringing a lot of people into politics, clarifying a lot of people's politics, and showing people that there are alternatives out there. But one of the issues, I think, with organizing around a presidential campaign is that you attract a lot of eyeballs, right? But because, you know, there's American presidential campaigns are such spectacles, we also taught a lot of people that like a lot of like left-wing activity is like observing, right? Because like, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of people who are out knocking on doors for Bernie Sanders, but because of the very nature of campaigns in the United States, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon was a lot of times it's like, well, come into a town near you, right? You're watching it happen in Iowa. It's like, oh, maybe it's going to come to my town eventually. And some people got to experience that, right? If they were in an early primary state, a lot of people didn't, you know, and I think that also sort of, you know, created a dynamic where more people, their engagement into this alternative was only through viewing, right? But
yeah, that's an interesting point. You know, I noticed that in 2008, Obama, he visited North Dakota, and he didn't win North Dakota, obviously, but like he didn't perform bad, and he crushed in Minnesota. But people in like Fargo, Moorhead, on the border of North Dakota and Minnesota, that was huge. That like a whole bunch of people went up, drove the interstate to go watch him speak there. And I mean, you also see that, again, this is still spectacle, right? But actually going there. And I mean, I think the way to do this, we have to do this outside of presidential elections where you notice what the left is doing in your community, outside of, you know, like the press or social media.
Exactly. And, you know, and again, this is not a criticism. This is just like looking at the history. This is not a criticism of that. Those are the limitations of what happened, right? I mean, that's just what happened. It's not like, oh, you're fucked up because this is how you got into it, right? Just saying this is like how it happened, and we need to understand that to build out of that, we need to understand where some of those limitations are. And I know we're running out of time, So maybe we'll do more about this, and maybe I'll spend some time on the next stream on Tuesday. But I think another thing that's really important for people to recognize is that while a lot of the working class is a part of like the left, the socialist left as we call it, they are not necessarily interchangeable things. And I think sometimes people make the mistake of seeing what the left is doing and mistaking that for what the working class is doing. And to bring it back to that original formation that Hal Draper puts forward, what the socialists need to be doing, is looking for parts in society, places in society where there are collisions between the ruling class and the working class, and using those moments to build viable political alternatives and organizations that can harness the energy and the dreams and the desires and the wants of the working class towards positive social movement.